Hello all, today we're going to take a look at caring nurses and assertive police officers. Social role information overrides gender stereotypes in linguistic behavior by Sendén, Siegley, and Chesney. It was published in the August 2020 issue of Social Psychological and Personality Science. If you'd like to read the paper for yourself, check the description down below for a citation and link. The premise for these studies is pretty simple. People have stereotypes for men and stereotypes for women. These stereotypes tend to fit into two categories, agency and communion. Agency refers to striving for goals, and communion refers to maintaining and nurturing social relationships. Furthermore, these stereotypes in part lead to gender segregation in the workplace. Men tend to be more common in occupations with greater agency, like police officers, and women tend to be more common in careers with greater communion, like nursing. However, what happens when you present someone with a male nurse and a female police officer? Which stereotype dominates, the gender or the occupation? Well, prior research has shown that when people just list the traits they associate with these combinations, the stereotype for the social role or job tends to win out. That said, in the real world, we aren't usually just listing out traits. Often the effects of stereotypes are more subtle, such as in our very language. Which brings us to the present series of studies. The authors had participants self-generate basic descriptive sentences to determine if these trends would hold. This method has the side benefit of being less susceptible to social desirability pressures. For studies 1, 2A, and 2B, they predicted that participants would tend to create gender stereotype conforming sentences and that they would create job stereotype conforming sentences more often than not. For Study 1, they recruited a final N of 53 participants through Amazon's Mechanical Turk. MTurk is a platform through which researchers can recruit participants. The participants are then compensated through the platform at an average rate of 10 cents per minute. The task itself was disguised as a survey assessing language competence. Participants first filled out a fake measure assessing their ability to write and produce nice pretty pieces of English language, and then completed a fill-in-the-blank task. Then came the real task. Participants were prompted to generate sentences using one word from each of the bubbles here. For example, they could write, "The hairdresser spoke. She was understanding." To avoid order effects, the order in which words appeared was counterbalanced across participants. Order effects are exactly what they sound like. They're an effect seen in your results that was due to the order in which information was presented. We control for this by making sure that different participants see the same words in a different order. For jobs, they picked the 3 most male-dominated, and 3 most female-dominated jobs in the US. And for trait adjectives, they chose ones that have been used previously for this same kind of experimental design. And now results. As usual, all the graphs in this video are my own creation based on information provided in the paper. Error bars represent 95% confidence intervals of the mean. They found that indeed participants selected occupations, genders, and traits that conform to stereotypes more often than not. Now, while people like me might be leery at the small sample size, they did do a post-hoc power analysis that showed more than sufficient power to find this effect. Statistical power is your ability to find a given effect given your study parameters. In a post-hoc power analysis, you calculate how big an effect you can reasonably detect given the sample size you were able to collect. I personally think it's preferable to do an a priori power analysis in which you calculate how big a sample you need to detect a predicted effect, so you can then go out and get that big a sample. However, that process is also flawed since you have to guess how big your effect is before you know how big that effect actually is. Usually you have prior research to help, but some still find that sketchy. For studies 2A and 2B, they sought to tease apart the effects of gender stereotypes and job stereotypes. So in study 2A, participants completed the same exercise, but with just occupations. For example, a participant could create the sentence, "The social workers were caring." People completed 4 sentences with male-dominated occupations, or 4 sentences with female-dominated occupations. And in 2B, participants did the same exercise with just gender. They created 4 sentences with men, or 4 sentences with women. Based on this prompt, someone could write the sentence, "The men were determined." And now results. In these graphs, higher scores indicate a greater frequency of participants selecting communal traits, and lower scores indicate higher rates of agentic traits. Participants who received female-dominated occupations chose more communal traits, and participants who received male-dominated occupations chose more agentic traits. and the same pattern held when participants were given female prompts or male prompts. That said, I am hesitant to wholeheartedly endorse that gender difference because it was only barely significant and that effect size is smaller than their sample was sufficiently powered to detect. Statistical significance is the likelihood that your finding is due to chance. If that probability is less than 5%, your finding is considered significant. For study 3, the authors wanted to then test what would happen when participants were prompted to create a sentence with a male subject and a female-dominated occupation, and vice versa. They predicted that people would choose traits that tend to reflect the social role rather than the gender. For example, a male nurse would be associated with more communal traits. They once again collected a sample of 719 participants across 2 different surveys administered through mTurk. I'm really not sure why they did it in 2 waves, and it makes me a smidge suspicious. To be fair, it could be something totally innocuous, like they suddenly got a bunch more funding before they were set to do their analyses, so they decided to collect more data. Unfortunately, there is a history in science of people continuing to collect data until they get significant results. If you want more on that, see the replication crisis. The procedure for study 3 was the same as it was for the prior studies, but this time there were 4 different conditions, and participants generated 4 different sentences, 1 for each condition. The 4 prompts were female-dominated professions and a female pronoun, female-dominated professions and a male pronoun, male-dominated professions and a male pronoun, and male-dominated professions and a female pronoun. So, for this male-dominated profession and a female pronoun, a participant could respond, "The pilot works. She is assertive." To analyze their data, the authors conducted a 2 occupation by 2 gender by 2 sample analysis of variance. ANOVA, as it is usually called, is a form of analysis that allows you to compare the group means of many groups across, in this case, 3 dimensions to each other. The reasons the authors included sample as a dimension is to control for any possible effect that could exist since the total dataset was collected at 2 time points. And now results. On this graph, higher scores indicate more communal ascriptions, and lower scores indicate more agentic ascriptions. In line with their hypothesis, they found a main effect of social role and no main effect of gender. In other words, participants associated both men and women in female-dominated social roles as communal, and both men and women in male-dominated roles as agentic. There was no main effect of sample, but there was an interaction such that the effect of role information was slightly more prominent in the first sample than in the second. The effect size on that interaction was really quite low, so I personally wouldn't worry about it too much. Effect size is a measure of how big your effect is. Here I've listed partial eta squared, which signifies the percentage of total variance in your outcome of interest, in this case ascription index, that your independent variables describe. So this interaction only explained 0.7% of the total variance, so really not much. So in sum, this series of studies provided even more evidence that people tend to stereotype women, and thus female-dominated occupations, as more communal. Men and male-dominated jobs, on the other hand, are stereotyped as more agentic. Furthermore, when people are presented with men in a female-dominated occupation and women in a male-dominated occupation, the stereotype for the occupation tends to overrule the gender stereotype. The sentence generation task has certain limitations, though. Participants didn't freely generate sentences. They had to choose words from a provided list. That has the upside of increasing their internal validity, that is, your ability to measure what you actually want to measure, but decrease their external validity, that is, how well their results generalize outside of the metaphorical lab. In a real-world context in which people are coming up with their own descriptions, these trends may or may not hold. It should also be noted that participants weren't describing people they knew, just hypothetical people, so that could limit generalizability. The authors listed one other limitation, and I found it a bit puzzling. They argued that these results can only be looked at within the US cultural context, and thus should not be understood to hold universally. While all of that is true, I'm not sure how I feel about listing that as a limitation since this paper is, in effect, about an aspect of US culture. It would be like saying your study about frog diet is limited by the fact that it is only about frogs and should not be extended to fish. Disagree with me in the comments if you'd like. In the future, I'd love to see some studies looking at this same subject matter, but in tweets and news stories, for example. You could look at how people describe various figures who conform or don't conform to gender stereotypical jobs, and see if the authors tend to use communal or agentic descriptors. It'd also be cool to look for potential factors that might change this pattern. For example, what if you showed a video of a female and male police officer being more communal in their jobs? Would participants rate them as equally communal and agentic, or not? I don't know the answer, but it'd be cool to find out. Well, that's all for this paper. Like, share, and subscribe. And if you've got a paper you'd like me to dissect, or more thoughts on this one, let me know in the comments.